Hello again, everyone. Now we're going to talk about part 3 of our early childhood cognitive development lecture, and this section is focused on language learning in the early childhood period. As you might imagine, language is absolutely pivotal to every kind of cognition in early childhood. In fact, early childhood is thought to be a very sensitive period, or the best time, to master vocabulary, grammar, and articulation or pronunciation. And this is particularly why it's important to read to young children, because the more contact they have with symbol systems, both by being spoken to, listened to, read to, all of those things, the better their language skills will get. So the average child knows about 100 to 2,000 words by age 2, and usually has more than 5,000 and approximating 30,000 by the age of 6. So we can look at that as an absolute vocabulary explosion. This is the time when language and vocabulary build really quickly. Comprehension, or a child's ability to understand what's being said, usually develops more quickly than the child's ability to express himself, which we also refer to as language production. Early on, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, conjunctions, those sorts of things can all be mastered. Usually, vocabulary begins with nouns and then moves into things that are harder to picture. Language theorists talk about a process called fast mapping, which has a lot to do with how quickly children can learn new words. Basically, the idea is that our brains are set up so that young children will learn learn new words by placing them in kind of mental categories that they have according to how they perceive the meaning. So they were very, very quickly process words based on their understanding, and through fast mapping can grow their vocabularies incredibly quickly. They also, though, may make some errors in how they understand words, and those errors can persist over time. As children are learning their vocabulary, they also are beginning to learn other structures of language, such as grammar and the social use of language, which we refer to as pragmatics. And let's talk about each of these in turn. The grammar of a language is actually the structure or the rules that everyone has sort of agreed upon that will help to communicate and clarify the meaning of the words. So things like where the verb is in a sentence, or what we might call word order, becomes important. Things like prefixes, suffixes, tenses of verbs, all of those have to do with grammar. Over-regularization is an error that we often see in young children where they are overly applying the rules of grammar, even when there are some exceptions, which they tend to become aware of as they get older. So over-regularization is kind of applying the rules of grammar too strictly. A good example of this is when a child adds the suffix ed to anything that happened in the past, even when it doesn't really work for that particular word. So instead of saying, I swam in the pool yesterday, they'd say, I swimmed, where they are overly applying the ed rule. Pragmatics is different than language structure, but actually refers to the practical use or social use of language, things that one needs to do to communicate appropriately with other people. So it includes things like taking your turn in a conversation, or adding certain intonation to words in your sentence to get across how you're feeling about something. Pragmatics involves understanding the social rules of communication and then adjusting what you are communicating based on who you are talking to, in other words, your audience, and the situation that you're in or the context. Now, early childhood, as a sensitive period for language development, is the best time to take on a second language. And there's a lot of research that suggests that a young child who learns more than one language or is becoming bilingual may actually develop a very, very strong and healthy brain, which some scientists suggest is actually at less risk of later cognitive disorders such as dementia or age-related cognitive decline. So, building up these early connections amongst brain systems is a positive side effect of exposing a child to a second language. That second language can be anything from, say, Spanish to Russian to Chinese, could also be sign language or a visual language. Some would argue that music is a version of a mathematical language, and that teaching a young child to understand and read music may have similar effects in developing a healthy brain as learning a second language. When a young child is learning two languages at the same time, early on, their development in the second language may seem a little bit slower, but then is likely to catch up. The goal is to eventually become what is described as a balanced bilingual, where a person is fluent in both languages, not favoring one over the other. The best way to help a child reach this stage is if the child is in multiple environments where each language is being used. A child has to learn a language in a functional context, it is thought, in order for that language to be mastered and generalized to new situations. So children who may be speaking one language at home and another language at school may need a little extra time to get competent in both languages, but as they progress, they will eventually get to this point of being a balanced bilingual where they can go back and forth or do what's called code switching as needed in both languages. So that's what we have to say about language development in the early childhood period. Most important take-home fact would be this is a sensitive period for language development. Children need lots of practice. They need to be playing, because play is a way that we can develop an imagination, which is a version of inner language. We also recognize that this is a time period where children are learning the social use of language and are beginning to understand the social rules and the cultural conventions around communicating with each other. One of the most important things that adults can do for children in this age is to read to them, expose them to a variety of viewpoints and perspectives through children's literature. So in our next and final part of this lecture on Chapter 9, Cognitive Development in Early Childhood, we're going to discuss early childhood educational environments. And for now, thanks for attending to our lecture on language.